Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we'll be focusing on a new book by Dorothy Sue Cobble entitled For the Many, American Feminists and the Global Fight for Democratic Equality, published by Princeton University Press just last month. Joining us for the discussion will be Catherine Marino and Yvette Richards. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University, co-chair of the Washington History Seminar. My colleague, Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center has, for this session, turned over the co-chairing duties to Sonia Michel, professor emerita from the University of Maryland and a former director of the American program at the Wilson Center. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association's National History Center. And for over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times at the Wilson Center in person, since pandemic restrictions in the virtual realm. We just sent out an announcement for our continuing lineup of programs that run through late July, including one this coming Monday, June 21st at 4 p.m., when we return to discuss Teasel Muir Harmony's recent book, Operation Moonglow, A Political History of Project Apollo. We invite you to come back and join us for that session. Behind the scenes, there are two people who make these seminars possible, Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center and Rachel Wheatley of the National History Center. And we'd like to thank our financial supporters of the seminar, both anonymous and not anonymous. And as always, we invite you to join their ranks. On the logistics front, please note today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function on Zoom or the Q&A function as well. Those watching on Facebook Live, you can email questions to Rachel Wheatley, whose email address is posted in the chat function. We will call on as many folks as we can. And with that, I'm happy to turn the screen over to Sonia Michel, my old friend, who will be introducing today's speakers. Sonia, the Zoom screen, all yours.
I'm really happy to be here today to co-chair with Eric, and especially to discuss this wonderful book by Dorothy Sue Cobble, a historian I have known for many, many years. Dorothy Sue Cobble is a distinguished professor emerita of history and labor studies at Rutgers University, where she specialized in 20th century politics and social movements. She, in addition to the book that we're going to discuss today, she's the author of 5 other books, which were won many much acclamation and awards. I first got to know Dorothy Sue when she, through her book, Dishing It Out, Waitresses and Their Unions in the 20th Century. And I learned that was one of the, being a waitress was just one of the many jobs that she held growing up. So a lot of her historical writing is based on her own personal experience, and she'll tell us a little more about that. She has won honors and fellowships from the Russell Sage Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Swedish Research Council. And in 2017, Stockholm University awarded her an honorary doctorate of social science. And she has also been a fellow at the Wilson Center. So we're now going to turn it over to Professor Cobble, and she will tell us more about her book, For the Many. Dorothy Sue.
Thanks, Sonia, for that full and kind introduction. I appreciate it. And I just want to thank the Washington History Seminar and Eric for inviting me to speak. And let me thank Rachel Wheatley too at the National History Center for her advice and help in coordinating today's event. A special word of thanks to the Woodrow Wilson Center. As Sonia said, I was a fellow there. Was some 20 years ago, and it was enormously beneficial to me and made it possible for me to finish my second book. I was an admirer then of the center's determined efforts to foster historically informed research on critical policy issues, and I remain so today. I'm really thrilled to have Yvette Richards and Catherine Marino as commentators this afternoon. Both are extraordinary scholars, and I depended on their research and expertise in writing some of the key sections of my new book. It's great too to have Sonia as a co-host and part of the conversation. So I look forward to everybody's comments and insights, and also to hearing from you in the audience. I've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes on my new book, so I'll dive right in. I'm going to start with the aims for the book, what I hope to accomplish when I began research for it about 14 years ago as a fellow at Harvard's Warren Center. And then I'll conclude by offering a brief overview of what you'll find in the book itself. For the Many is prompted by a desire to write history that can speak to a broad audience and illuminate our contemporary moment. I especially hope the book would be useful and inspiring to those engaged in public affairs and in efforts to improve societal well-being. At the same time, I wanted to speak to scholarly debates and recast some of our historical understandings. And I see my contributions in this way falling into three broad overlapping areas: US political history, global history, and women's history. Like many historians of women, I believe US politics cannot be understood apart from women's political culture and activism. But we've yet to capture what historian Mary Beard called the, quote, full power and presence, unquote, of women in shaping American politics. So I wanted to move us further toward that longstanding goal. In the book, I sought to recover the long and wide stream of US women's egalitarian social democratic politics over the last century. It's a tradition I call full rights feminism. It's a tradition, I argue, that it was more robust and influential than we have imagined, with full rights feminists in the forefront of shifting US political culture to the left, remaking the Democratic Party, bolstering grassroots democratic movements, and enacting progressive state policies at home and abroad. I believe that it's a tradition with much to teach us about how to confront the challenges of our time. Like many of us today, the women in For the Many sought ways of countering rising authoritarianism and corporate power. They too battle stark economic inequalities within and among nations. And they too fought to revalue care work and end the dehumanization and demonization of the other. Their solutions, though partial, I believe bear reassessment and reclaiming. Let me take a minute to say more about what full rights feminists believed and why I chose the phrase full rights to characterize their politics. I consider the central figures in For the Many feminists because they believed women faced disadvantages as a sex and they sought to end those disadvantages. I adopted the modifier full rights, a term that was used by my historical subjects to foreground their fight for the full array of rights, political, civil, social, and economic, and their conviction that these rights were intertwined and inseparable. I also use the phrase, as did they, to distinguish their politics from an equal rights individualist tradition of feminism that, in their view, conceived of women's rights narrowly as legal equality between men and women. Full rights feminists wanted more. Only by confronting multiple and interconnected injustices, they argued, could the problems of the many be solved. They wanted women's rights in a more egalitarian, democratic world. In the book, I follow full rights feminists in their search for social democratic allies at home and abroad. I also put them in conversation with those to their right and to their left. For example, they clashed with conservatives over social welfare and labor legislation, the role of the state, and the rights due workers, immigrants, and people of color. They parted ways with them too, those who found authoritarian workplaces and cutthroat capitalism acceptable. They disagreed with isolationists and go-it-alone nationalists, and not so amicably, over the extent and nature of America's responsibilities in the world, America's relation to international law, norms, and institutions, and how best to achieve global stability, peace, and prosperity. At the same time, they differed with those on the left who espoused revolutionary violence, or who, after the Bolshevik Revolution, conflated socialism with Soviet-style communism. They rejected authoritarianism where they saw it, whether it was on the right or the left, and they opposed the dictatorship of any person or class. Armed struggle and one-party rule, they believed, were weapons of the arrogant and the unimaginative. Violence and coercion, in their view, perpetuated violence and coercion. Full rights feminists chose nonviolent, direct action to advance their ends. They also relied on the ballot box, legislative policymaking, and popular education. I want to stress that education was not an afterthought. Indeed, it turned out to be much more pivotal to their worldview than I had anticipated. The Bryn Mawr Summer School for Women Workers in Industry, a radical experiment in democratic pedagogy, union building, and social inclusion, I think epitomized their expansive vision. That's why I put it on the cover of For the Many, and you'll see a multiracial group of students and faculty from the school looking back at us. The photo was taken after students voted in 1925, when the second KKK was at its peak nationwide, to open the school to all women. The Bryn Mawr decision came at a pivotal moment in the movement. In the 1920s, organizations like the Women's Trade Union League, the Y, and the National Consumers League, three of the most important white-led full rights women's groups, took steps to address racial exclusion and better reflect the priorities of all women. But as we know, these changes came too slowly for many, both inside and outside these groups. And such changes in formal policy, while welcome, were hardly sufficient. In writing the book, I struggled with how best to tell the story of the diversity of US women's social democratic politics, while also holding to the thread of its evolution over the 20th century. I tried to capture the shifting relation between white-led women's groups and those led by women of color, as well as the ongoing racism and racial separatism in US politics, including in women's politics. But at the same time, I wanted to show the conflict within organizations over differences of all kinds, race, class, religion, and nationality, and how those tensions existed side by side with friendships and alliances across difference, even in the most regressive eras. Full rights feminists did not always live up to the democratic and inclusive ideals they espoused, nor did their actions always have the desired effects. Like their allies as well as their foes, full rights feminists could be ethnocentric and misguided. Power imbalances and hierarchical notions of peoples and nations affected their choices, and at times blinded them to the needs and realities of others. Still, many did reject the dominant imperial, racist, and elitist presumptions of their day. And as I detail, their reform efforts often furthered concrete and progressive change. I'm going to shift gears and spend a minute talking about global history and my desire to globalize the history of 20th century US feminism. For me, global history is about capturing connections and movements across borders and of understanding local, national, and regional developments in a global context. It is not a history of everything or of every place in the world. It is a way of writing history and of thinking about change. As we know, the rise of global and transnational history has dramatically transformed how we write US history. Nonetheless, synthetic accounts of 20th century US feminism still largely concentrate on domestic developments and rely on nation-centered explanatory frameworks. In contrast, I wanted to give equal weight to the international activities of US feminists and show how global events, peoples, and ideas shaped and inspired the movement's fortunes and priorities. The world made American feminism, I argue. It sprang from the foreign-born and the native-born, from citizen and non-citizen, from sojourners who stayed for days or years, and from those who never set foot inside US borders. Australia's Alice Henry, Sweden's Sigrid Ekendahl, or India's Ella Bhatt left their mark on US feminism, just as did Polish immigrant Rose Schneiderman, German refugee Toni Sinder, or Panamanian bred Maida Springer. Like many others writing international and diplomatic history, I also judged informal networks and non-state actors as significant makers of world affairs. Yet I wanted to foreground the economic dimensions of internationalism and generate more attention to cross-border labor networks, specifically working women's networks. That meant shining a light on the International Labor Organization and on trade union organizations, arguably the largest NGOs in the 20th century. Trade unions are rarely part of the story of the rise of civic and NGO activism, despite their size, international reach, and influence. Labor and socialist internationalism, as we know, has a long, honorable, though uneven, history of cross-border solidarity. But what happened to this tradition in the 20th century, and how did women use and remake it? Although not your typical international actors, working class women loom large in my story, beginning with Rose Schneiderman and Mary Anderson. Yet the battle of working class women to transform male-led labor organizations and political parties, as well as secure their interest in elite-dominated women's groups, was not easy. Their distinctive class and sex politics, a vision that reflected their needs as women and workers, was marginalized in both these arenas. I can say more later if people are interested about how attention to the feminisms of non-elite women challenges the standard temporal and conceptual framing of much feminist history. That's a project that runs through many of my books. I can also say later, any people have questions about my research process and the archives that I relied on in the US and abroad, I'm happy to elaborate there. I just wanted to use the minutes remaining to give you a brief sense of how the book unfolds and point to a few things I discovered. I open the book with the dramatic rise of US women's social democratic politics in the early 20th century and the efforts of US women alongside their counterparts abroad to shape the first set of international labor standards in 1919. The women of 1919, I argue, formulated a set of radical demands. Among them were living wages and hour limits for both sexes, full civil and political rights, the right of all to education and healthcare, and state income and services for mothers as a social right. Most agreed too that such benefits should be for all mothers, not limited to or tied to wage earning or labor market participation. Women lacked voting rights at the 1919 ILO, but by organizing transnationally, they left their mark, most notably on the ILO's maternity convention, though they, as a pattern in this story, they did not achieve everything they wanted. But I also tell the story of Japan's Tanaka Taka, who, in alliance with US women in 1919, stirred up a firestorm over gender and class relations in Japan that had significant global reverberations. Piecing together that story took me some few years at least. It was an unexpected but gratifying detour, and I can come back to that and tell you what I found and how I came to write it. The International Women's Federation that was set up in 1919 dissolved by the mid-20s, but informal networks and friendships did not. And the agenda inspired social democratic women's activism into the interwar years and beyond. The rest of the book traces US full rights feminism over the next 100 years, intertwining reform efforts at home and internationally. Famous women, Frances Perkins, Mary McLeod Bethune, Eleanor Roosevelt appear, but just as much attention is given to other less well-known women. Who US women looked to as models and allies shifted over time, and not always in the ways I expected. Transatlantic exchange remained of enduring interest, with Sweden and the UK prominent, but trans-Pacific ties were important too. Australian influence was considerable, although it ebbed by the 1930s, while at the same time US-India linkages intensified, especially between Afro-American and Indian women. US-India connections and the influence of India on US social democratic feminism runs through the book, beginning in 1919 and continuing into the present. So too does US women's involvement in Pan-Africanism, which expanded in the 20s with the founding of the International Council of Women of the Darker Races. I pay attention as well to the fraught relation between women in the US and Latin America, a relationship shaped by US empire, military invasion, and the exploitation of US corporations. I pick up this tale in the 20s as US women attend Pan-American Union and ILO conferences and travel south on behalf of the US Women's Bureau. Some of the most fruitful US Latin American partnerships occurred in the ILO, but there are also moments of cross-border affinity in the Pan-American Union. I was lucky here to be able to draw on Catherine Marino's meticulous work in thinking about Pan-American feminism, and I look forward to her comments. In the middle sections of the book, I focus on the long New Deal, stretching from the 30s to the 60s. I depict it as an era of advance for women, as the full rights agenda of socialized markets, labor rights, and social welfare moves forward. I think we still underestimate the degree to which the New Deal was beholden to a progressive women's network, even as books on the New Deal pour off the presses. Before the 30s, women had led the charge for social and labor legislation for decades and were central to remaking the Democratic Party in the 20s. With FDR's election, full rights feminists secured top government posts, and they came armed with a set of concrete policies, many tested abroad or in local and state government at home. New Deal feminists were deeply involved in international affairs as well. They partnered with allies around the world to push forward universal rights declarations in the 1940s ILO and the UN. In the early 50s, they were instrumental in the fight for key ILO conventions on equal pay and enhanced maternity. Their work with trade unions in the 50s, as well as the 60s, was equally significant. To tell this part of the story, I focused on Esther Peterson, who lived in Europe for almost a decade, immersed in post-war European and international trade union affairs, and Maida Springer, who spent much of the 50s and 60s in Africa, intent on furthering the global Black freedom struggle and building democratic trade unions. Springer's life is masterfully presented in Yvette's two books, and I am very much in debt to her for those volumes and for her helpful comments on my rendering of Springer. In the 60s, full rights feminists like Peterson, who by 1961 was the highest ranking woman in the Kennedy administration, sought alternative US development strategies and used what they had learned abroad, especially about paid and unpaid household labor, to reformulate US policy. My final chapters take the story into the present with the rise of new feminisms around the world and the continuing fight for economic and social justice in the face of corporate domination, market fundamentalism, and Cold War posturing. Let me end by saying that For the Many is not meant to be a comprehensive account of 20th century US feminism. I'm not even sure that is possible. What I hope is that it illuminates some forgotten corners of our past. It challenges some outmoded and limiting ways of thinking, that it inspires more attention to labor and social democratic traditions in the US and around the world, and opens up possibilities for other scholars. I'll stop here and pass the baton, I guess, to Eric or to Sonia, I'm not sure. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sue. Sonia? Once.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Dorothy. This was really an inspiring talk about a very inspiring book. It's just daunting that one person has written this book, and it would take an entire, probably take half the historical profession to comment on it adequately, but we have today two wonderful commentators who will certainly address some of the key parts of the book. Catherine Marino, whose work on Latin America will illuminate some of the points that Dorothy just mentioned, and Yvette Richards, who works on African American and Pan-Africanism, who will address those aspects of the book. So we're going to start with Catherine, who is an associate professor at UCLA, where her research and teaching interests include 20th century US and Latin American history, the histories of women, gender, sexuality, and race in the Americas, in the Americas, Human Rights, U.S. Empire, and Transnational Feminism. Her book, which Dorothy Sue mentioned, her first book, Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement, came out a couple of years ago. And in it, she developed the concept of feminismo, or the people she writes about, developed the idea of feminismo americano, which was promoted by Latin American and Caribbean activists, feminist activists, and they focused on global feminism and human rights. So Catherine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much to the Wilson Center and to the National History Center for inviting me to be in conversation with scholars who I admire so much and have learned so much from. Dorothy Cobble, of course, and also Yvette Richards and Sonia Michel, and to talk about Dorothy Sue Cobble's wonderful new book, For the Many. I also wanted to mention on a personal note that I'm grateful for Dorothy Cobble's mentorship and friendship over these many years. We share the same dissertation advisor, Stell Friedman, and that's provided me with a wonderful connection to Dorothy Cobble, who even before we met in person read a graduate research paper I'd written on the Watsonville canning strike of Mexican and Mexican-American immigrant women workers, cannery workers in the 1980s. And she was incredibly generous in her feedback. Also in grad school, I was really transformed by reading her book, The Other Women's Movement in graduate school. It really transformed how I thought about working women in feminism. And that book really showed how working women were advancing some of the most progressive feminist demands in the 40s and 50s, a period usually believed to be the, quote, doldrums of feminism in the US between the first and second waves. And her new book, For the Many, really continues to challenge this conventional wisdom about US feminist history on a very large scale. It's a sweeping account from the teens to the 1990s of a rethinking of US feminist history through foregrounding social welfare and economic justice activists and goals, and on a global scale. As I don't want to repeat too much of what Dorothy summarized in her book, but she calls these women full rights feminists because they did not define their feminism around an individualist or singularly sort of equal rights framework or agenda. They instead demanded a much broader conception of rights for women, including economic justice and social welfare, as well as rights for all people at home and abroad, regardless of race, class, or sex. And this politics was very similar to what I was finding in my own work on Latin American feminists, and I really appreciated the learning more about the ways in which, as Dorothy Cobble explains, the origins for a lot of these goals emerged out of women's, gatherings around the ILO in 1919. These sort of demands for rights for all, regardless of race, sex, religion, were coming out of these international women's labor movements right after the First World War, when they started to organize collectively and internationally. I think that's a very profound contribution. And again, this really meaningfully challenges the typical narrative of feminist history. I noticed in the comments, someone asked, how does this book challenge the wave metaphor? And I think that, the typical story sees, and as much as historians have tried to overturn this wave model, the typical wave model sees feminism emerging in a first wave in the US, defined around suffrage, women's right to vote, and ending in 1920 when the 19th Amendment, the suffrage amendment occurs. And then it sees it reemerging in a second wave in 1963 when Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. And these two framings of these waves really narrow our conception of feminism around a predominantly white women's movements, goals focused around individual rights and just equal rights under the law. And also, as Dorothy Cobble mentioned, a very national and domestic movement. And so Dorothy Cobble's book really turns this on its head by showing that those years, especially between those two, 1920 and the 1960s, were years of tremendous feminist ferment. And that it's really only through understanding international engagements of these full rights feminists that we can really even understand what comes later in the 60s and 70s. And I also, it's a much more diverse cast, obviously, of activists than perhaps we think of this period of feminism being as well. We see, as Dorothy Cobble mentioned, feminist immigrants from Eastern Europe, from other parts of the world, African descended women like Panamanian-born Maida Springer Kemp and Polly Murray. And I also really appreciated the foregrounding of the International Labor Organization and the international activism around the AFL-CIO as a totally new landscape through which to understand feminist policymaking and feminist collaboration and transnational activism. I think that's an incredibly original contribution that has a lot of explanatory power. So I feel like I'm focusing less on the Latin American angle just because I learned so much new stuff from this book. And I think I came away from it especially energized by how Dorothy Cobble uses people as windows into these transnational movements. I was really left struck by her portraits of Maida Springer Kemp, Esther Peterson, and Polly Murray. Those three activists, and especially Kemp and Peterson, they really span the whole book in a way, or especially the 30s through the 60s. And it was fascinating to see how they were using forums like the ILO and other international summits as places to work out ideas, and how these summits became places that function in a way as blueprints for policies that later they took into the national and domestic realm as well. And they really become this kind of connective tissue in such a compelling way between the 1920s and 30s and then the 60s and 70s. Esther Peterson, for instance, was really the instrumental force behind John F. Kennedy's President's Commission on the Status of Women that became this critical node of feminist exchange and policy implementation. And it really drew, as Cobble shows, on these longstanding ideals of full rights and social justice. And also, it's so helpful, I think, to see Polly Murray in this network of full rights feminists. We, thanks to a lot of wonderful work on Murray, we understand the instrumental role she played in utilizing the 14th Amendment as a critical way into aside from the ERA, in dismantling gender-based oppression. And this is something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, took up in all these pivotal cases in the 70s. But thanks to Dorothy Cobble's book, we understand how she was in such close dialogue and fruitful dialogue in these earlier years with these transnational full rights feminists, and then collaborated really closely, of course, with Esther Peterson in the 60s and was instrumental in the creation of the National Organization Women. And again, I focus on the feminist historical contributions because that's where so much of my own work has been. But as Dorothy Cobble mentions, this book makes critical contributions to political history more broadly, showing how these activists were not just broadening women's rights and justice in the US, but more broadly responsible for really shaping and formulating social welfare and economic justice policies for men and women in the US and globally. So I don't want to take up too much more time, but I just had a few questions that I wanted to pose, not all of which we need to obviously get to. One is that I just kept thinking about the contemporary relevance of your book as I was reading it. The ways in which we're seeing today a lot of the a resonance of these full right feminist politics with the leadership of women, especially women of color in politics and the Democratic Party. Also, these new policies that are finally sort of getting discussion around childcare policies, reproductive, acknowledgements of reproductive labor, especially during COVID. And also global labor movement strikes, many of which women and people of color are leading: teachers, nurses, fast food workers, other low-wage workers. So I was curious about how much you were thinking about our contemporary moment as you're writing the book, obviously, this took place over a long span of time, and I know you saw different administrations as you were writing this book, but I'm curious how contemporary issues were shaping your thinking about it, if at all. And I also loved how you ended the book with some advice from full rights feminists to people today, and I wondered if you could maybe highlight some of the most important insights that they might offer to us today. And then another question was about education, because one of the through lines I really appreciated so much was this emphasis on popular education, not only with the Bryn Mawr summer program, but other educational centers that you highlight throughout the book. And I just wondered if you could expand on the role of education for these full rights feminists and for this movement more broadly, how they thought of education, if it's different from how we think of it in general today. I also was just curious about the curriculum of the Bryn Mawr summer program, how much, how they address these race-specific issues, gender-specific labor issues, and what the afterlives of these educational programs were. Third, I really appreciated how the book, again, uses individual women and their experiences at these international conferences to highlight a place of exchange of ideas. And you also highlight how they're learning from women from other parts of the world. I wondered if you could highlight one example that you found important of when a US feminist was learning something from an activist from another part of the world, or learning something from these international conversations that maybe changed the way they thought. I was also curious about the role of the Cold War in all of this, and I really appreciated your, nuanced approach to this, and how you really show that, it was difficult to for these full rights feminists to avoid the the homogenization and the polarization that the Cold War produced. I was curious too about the ways in which this worked out with Esther Peterson, but maybe for other full rights feminists as well, where they sort of downplayed or maybe ignored the role of the US in militarization of the Americas, for instance. Was this a pragmatic move in which they were, trying to, I guess I was just curious whether Esther Peterson sort of turned a blind eye to these things because she was dealing with the AFL-CIO, which was a male-dominated group, and she had to pick her battles, or if she believed that the US was promoting justice throughout the world, including in these military sort of ventures in the Americas specifically. And then my last question was just, why have we forgotten these women? Is it because you end with the sort of the new left and the countercultural movements, the late 60s and 70s, kind of attaching themselves to a more radical politics than say Esther Peterson's politics? Or is it also because of the enduring legacy of the Cold War and shaping how we think about history and feminism? So I hope I didn't take up too much time. Thank you for your wonderful book and for letting me be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous comments, and of course, many questions. Should I respond to some of these questions now, Eric,
Sure.
while they're fresh?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see. You asked, I guess your first question really had to do with the relevance of this book to the present moment. And since it took 14 years to finish, the present moment changed, and I was pleased about that. I wasn't planning to take it into the 21st century, but I was invited by one of my colleagues to participate in these gatherings that the Solidarity Center sponsored of working women's organizations all over the world. And these were in Cape Town and in Sao Paulo. And I was very inspired by what I heard there, and realized that there was so much more to say about the rise of working women's movements in the midst of the sort of rise of conservatism and market fundamentalism in the US. So I wanted to take the story into the present day. And, you know, like many scholars, I see many parallels between our moment and not so much the New Deal yet, even though there's some parallels there, but with the continuing struggles of the progressive era. And one of the things I found so inspiring about the women that I write about is that they never lost sight of the interconnections between economic and political democracy, and the importance of the social. The book begins with a quote from Jane Addams about the common table. And these were women who believed that we could not make a better society unless all people participated in decision making, that we had something to learn from everybody. And I guess that connects, Catherine, a bit to your second question about education and why that was so important to them. I loved writing about the Bryn Mawr Summer School for Women Workers, Hilda Smith, who was one of the key figures in that. And you mentioned the legacies. She became the Bryn Mawr Summer School goes from 21 to 38, and it's part of a much broader movement for workers' education in this moment. But Hilda Smith carries that into the WPA projects. Actually, Polly Murray worked on one of those projects. And one of the stories that I also tell is how Esther Peterson, who was in the 30s, one of the younger full rights feminists, brought what she learned at Bryn Mawr into her work abroad with the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions and this transnational alliance that Yvette's written about as well, to really transform that international organization. And I have a fantasy of writing a book with collaborators from all over who each choose one of the principal women who were responsible for organizing that 1953 conference and who participated in it. It came up with an amazing agenda of what working women wanted, and it was an international group from Latin America, Africa, all over. And it was that energy that really set the ball going in changing the international trade union movement, and in some ways leads right up to the present, where the ITUC, which is the successor organization, is led by an Australian woman, Sharon Barrow, who comes out of that women's committee. But just to say a bit more about the philosophy of Bryn Mawr, Hilda Smith said, she had this great quote, that their goal was to teach people not what to think, but to think. So it wasn't this kind of political education that's top down. It was premised on the notion that you had to begin with people's experience and you worked outward from there, that you got people to think about their problems socially, and then gave them the confidence and the tools to come up with solutions to those problems. So that was the goal of this school. And it was, I think, very, very inspiring in many of the things it did. I have these other 3 questions. Maybe I'll just put them in reserve and we'll come back to them because I've been going on too much about the first 2 questions.
Good. Sonia?
Okay, our second commentator is Yvette Richards, who is Associate Professor of History at George Mason University and a specialist in African American history, U.S. women's history, and Pan-Africanism. We are especially fortunate to have her because she not only she's published 2 books on Maida Springer, one called Maida Springer, Pan-Africanist and International Labor Leader, and an oral history companion book entitled Conversations with Maida Springer, A Personal History of Labor, Race, and International Relations. I assume that means that you actually met her. How fortunate. And I hope you'll talk a little bit about that. What an exciting opportunity that must have been. Since she was one of the major characters, and besides everything else, she was one of the major characters in Dorothy Sue Cobble's book. So I'll turn the floor over to Betty right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here. Ms. Kemp, as I called her, was a wonderful, welcoming, opening person. It took me a while to find her after I first learned about her. And then she invited me to Pittsburgh and had me stay in her house and talk to her about what I wanted. And I thought, this is strange. She doesn't know me. So after a while, I learned through her papers that she always did this. She always had a welcoming, opening home. So I happened to get a job in Pittsburgh at the university. And so we spent a lot of time together. And she got to know my children as well. And the companion book, the oral history book, was a fun book. That's the one I really wanted to write because she's very funny, you know, and has a way of very unusual and funny way of expressing herself sometimes. So I was glad I was able to put that one out after my first social history. I am happy to be here. Dorothy Cobble, your book is magnificent. I'm glad that I was chosen to speak on it. And I've enjoyed reading it, all 400 plus pages. I've learned a lot. I'd like to thank Eric and Michelle for being co-chairs of the Washington History Seminar. And I'd also like to thank my co-commentator, Catherine Marino, for presenting along with me. And last but not least, I'd like to thank those of you out in the audience who are here with us, despite now having the choice post-vaccination to go outside. Dorothy Cobble's magnificent sweeping saga of the 100 plus year struggle in the United States for full rights feminism introduces us to a large cast of characters whose lives intersected through friendships, partnerships, and memberships in a host of organizations, institutions, conferences, and state and national and international government and labor bodies. This book is breathtaking in the way that it excavates so many large and small organizing efforts to tell the story of those who sought common ground, that common table, in shaping a vision that would raise the standard for working women and by extension for all of humanity. The organizational networks of these women were intricately connected, starting with the WTUL, the Women's Trade Union League. It was connected to the Settlement House movement and specifically to Jane Addams' Hull House, which looms large in importance here. The National Consumer League and the industrial departments of the YWCA were also part of this network. Later, the National Council of Negro Women joined, but alongside these organizational movements led by white women were a whole range of organizational national and international movements led by Black people and Black women in particular. Connecting the networks internationally were organizations like the World YWCA and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and also the International Federation of Working Women. On the US federal level, these women networked through the Women's Bureau, the US Children's Bureau, and the Presidential Commission on the status on women. And I was pleased to see how many women ran for office and held governmental positions. Their activism was nurtured through educational programs that various institutions, unions, and organizations promoted. And many of these women did educational work within their unions, including Maida Springer, Esther Peterson, Dolly Lothar Robinson, and Pauline Newman. They all felt that it was important to teach the whole person. Mary Anderson said, "The organizational girl is the thinking girl." These programs made women realize their self-worth and their right to a greater standard of life. Travel was also an important part of their education for the exchange of ideas it facilitated and for understanding differences, if not resolving them, especially in the Pan-American context. Their breadth of activism can only be grasped through the understanding of them as a multi-generational collective. They strategized together, learned from one another, sometimes disagreed with one another, which led to accepting differences, sharpening their argument, evolving their strategies and goals, and sometimes falling out temporarily. Maida Springer and Pauli Murray fell out at least 3 times that I know of. Younger women who came into the networks brought greater racial diversity and egalitarianism. Together, they counted many victories, the ILO conventions regarding maternity rights, equal remuneration, more controversially, the night work limitations. They helped to reinvent the ILO through the 1944 Philadelphia Declaration. And these New Deal feminists helped to shape great social advances, the Social Security Act, the Wagner Act, Fair Labor Standards Act, on up until equal pay and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But as Cobble notes, their struggle was not one of linear progression. In their drive to make real economic security and social justice for women workers, there were many setbacks, disappointments, goals that fell short, and they were subjected to resurgences of conservative political power in Congress and the courts that opposed social rights and corporate regulations. They suffered emotionally and financially through misrepresentation and demonization of their politics, through red baiting and race baiting techniques, the Taft-Hartley Act and the slow decline of union strength, especially in male-dominated industries, were depressing setbacks. But even in the decline that included the splintering of the women's movement by the 1980s, there were hidden feminisms growing in the 1990s, led by women of color, working class women, and LGBT activists. Lisa Levinstein has a new book out about this. And women of the Global South, with their priorities and experiences, were becoming predominant in international conferences. That was a good thing. They're bringing in their priorities to the fore. There was a little hope and change in the US before another right-wing backlash led by the man who remains unnamed in the book, but whose unjust administration played a role in galvanizing people to organize the Women's March, the hashtag #MeToo movement, and Black Lives Matter. Today, Energy for Full Rights Feminism, Cobble has pointed out, is in organizing precarious and informal workers. She gives great attention to the Self-Employed Women's Association. Also, she covers the struggle to get rights for domestic workers, agricultural workers, and also sex workers. As Cobble notes, some of the early 20th century women did not measure up to the potential of full rights feminism. They sometimes left unexamined deep-seated racism, ethnocentrism, nationalism, stereotypical thinking, and the impact of US imperialism. But many others demonstrated an admirable capacity for expansive growth in the fight against racism, classism, and intolerance, as they fought for intertwined rights, economic and social, as well as political and civil. The one area where I see that they fell short was on the issue of disability rights, especially the right of people with disabilities to access to employment and access to education and just general access to buildings, etc. Women of color with disabilities are disadvantaged the most by these multiple discriminations. Unfortunately, some businesses have used Section 14C of the Fair Labor Standards Act as an excuse to pay people with disabilities sub-minimum wages. At first, this section was intended for returning soldiers, veterans with disabilities, to ease them back into the workforce, but has since been used as a tool of exploitation. A recent Academy Award nominating documentary, Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution. I urge everybody to see it if they haven't. It's on Netflix, it's online. Tells the story of how a network of disability rights activists as teens started at Camp Jened during the Woodstock era, and how they found a center in San Francisco and made alliances with Vietnam vets with disabilities, the Black Panthers, LGBT groups, the United Farm Workers, and the International Association of Machinists. And these groups helped them fight for the first federal civil rights protections for people with disabilities, which was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. One of two of my students this year, I'm indebted to for helping me to see these connections, the necessary and fundamental connections between disability rights and working women's issues. One of them is Charlotte Woodward. She's has Down syndrome, and an act is named after her. It's called the Charlotte Woodward Organ Transplant Discrimination Act. And I urge all of you to go online and sign the petition to get this act turned into a law. I'd like to make a last comment about legal equality feminists, a term that Dorothy borrows from Susan Zimmerman. I found in the language of Sonia Pressman, who did phenomenal work against sex discrimination in the EEOC, a legal equality feminist perspective. Pressman is an admirer of Alice Paul and a member of the National Women's Party. In contrast to full rights feminists, legal equality feminists under Alice Paul pushed a single issue, the ERA. Alice Paul did nothing to help Black women secure the vote after the 19 suffrage amendment was passed, but she was able to capitalize off the work of civil rights activists in the push for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. As Nancy McLean wrote in Freedom Is Not Enough, after a draft of the Civil Rights Bill circulated before the sex category had been added, the National Women's Party criticized the bill for failure to extend protection to a white woman, a woman of Christian religion, or a woman of United States origin. In her writings about her EEOC activism, Sonia Pressman seems unaware of this racist history. She seems not to have followed the civil rights movement and does not acknowledge the violence activists endured to bring about the Civil Rights Act that the National Women's Party activists capitalized on. She also seems unaware of Esther Peterson's role in bringing about the Equal Pay Act. By happenstance, she got an EEOC attorney position. She remarks, "As for me, when I came to the EEOC, I was blithely unaware of the legislative history of the act. I just read the law and thought it prohibited sex discrimination in employment." She credits Alice Paul and her lieutenants for lobbying segregationist Congressman Howard Smith to bring the sex category into the bill, although she notes that he did it with apparent mixed motives. But she states that he may have favored the amendment because he didn't want African Americans getting rights at the expense of white women. The position of Black women is hidden in her statement, and this failure to support full rights feminism points to why Pauli Murray, who had supported the addition of sex to the Civil Rights Act, particularly because of the intersectional limitations that Black women face, had problems with the National Organization for Women, an organization she and Pressman and others had helped to found. So I'll end there and ask you a few questions. Dorothy, would you elaborate on how the past tensions between full rights feminism and the legal equality feminism are still playing out today? The second question, you did a lot of traveling in many parts of the world to gather information to tell this transnational story of full rights feminism. Would you elaborate on how your experience of travel brought you closer to understanding what it was like for these full rights feminists in terms of building relationships and understandings across cultural and sometimes language divides. And I'd also like to know of some of the surprises that you found when you were presented with the wrong folder in the archives. I guess I'll ask this last question too. Your book has demonstrated how early generation of full rights feminists nurtured the second generation of more racially diverse full rights feminists. It seems that the millennials and Generation Zs are missing those direct generational transfers. To what extent is that a problem? Your epilogue presents the lessons and outlooks that full rights feminists have bequeathed to future generations. Do you see any older full rights feminists living today who are having mutual exchanges with today's younger activists? Kind of questions that cross with some of Catherine's too. Thank you.
Thank you, Betty. Eric, you're giving me the nod.
If you wanted to respond to anything you just heard.
Sure. Why don't I start with this question about the transfer from one generation to the next, because I think it's a really interesting question, and maybe other people can weigh in on this as well, commentators, my panelists, my co-hosts. But one of the things I was struck by was the 1930s moment. There was almost a seamless generational transfer, that there were organizations in which both the older and younger women were involved in building the labor movement, and the summer schools. There were many venues in which both old and young participated, and there was certainly an identity of aspiration. And you find people like Maida Springer talking about how Pauline Newman was one of the most, the women she admired most. So there was a real learning that took place from one generation to another. And, you know, there's a lot of work about the break of the late 60s and what happened with the rise of the boomers and how they thought about their own mothers and grandmothers. And I've written a lot about this, how the feminism of the mid-century, the 40s and 50s, was thought of as not feminist at all. Actually, I was surprised to see in Louis Menand's book that he said he doesn't really begin his story about women until 1963 with Betty Friedan, because in fact, they weren't involved in public life or in public activities. So there's this sense of they were just in the home. It was a conservative era, and they were happy to have babies, and they certainly didn't press against patriarchal structures. And I've always told a very different story about how they challenged what we could call the masculine mystique, and thought that the spheres in which women predominated, the work that women did, those things needed to be more valued, and that we needed to think beyond the masculine standard. And I think we're coming back to that. So their social democracy, their intersectionalism, we're returning to that again. And I think there is more appreciation of that generation. You can especially see it with the new and wonderful books on Pauline Murray. At the same time, it is really interesting how there was that break in the late 60s. And then again, people have written about how the so-called third wave of the 90s didn't think too well of its foremothers either. So I'm not quite sure why the 30s was different in that way, but it does seem that often new movements need to distinguish themselves from what went before, and need to believe that, in fact, they have a new vision, and that helps them carry on and helps them have a sense of identity. So I think that's a really interesting question. I don't know if other Catherine or Betty or Sonia, you want to add to that? Or not? Okay, I can I can try to address another of your questions, Betty. Let me see, I wrote this down. You asked me to say a bit more about my own travels and experience in writing the book, which I'm happy to do. I sometimes blame Lisa McGurr and Sven Beckert for getting me launched on the 1919 story in such an intense way, because I was at Harvard at the Warren Center, and they both had invitations to go to Japan, and Lisa McGurr couldn't go. So she asked me if I would go as Lisa McGurr. And I, on the plane over, I said, well, I was going to write about US feminists, but I thought, well, let me see if I can't think more about their connections with Japanese women. And I started reading Mary Anderson's autobiography, and there's a long account of Tanaka Taka in it. And I got fascinated by that. It turned out Mary Anderson had it mostly wrong. And so that was part of piecing the story together. But one of the reasons that I really loved working on this book is how much I learned from it, and how much I was pushed beyond my own parochialisms. Catherine mentioned that we both went to Stanford, and I have to say one of the reasons I went to Stanford is that I didn't have to learn foreign languages. And I did not have, I thought, really the skills to do this book. And I'm sure I made many, many mistakes in this book. And it's part of the reason why it took me a long time to kind of retool. I also was the really lucky beneficiary of a lot of transnational scholarly connections, people who helped me understand their own world, people who shared sources. I live in Princeton, and it so happened that the East Asian bibliographer didn't notice that I was a Rutgers person, not a Princeton person, and spent the summer helping me download information from Japanese newspapers about 1919 and Tanaka's role there. And then I was able to hire a young PhD student at Rutgers who helped me translate a lot of that material. Tanaka's story is really important because she was an important person in the Japanese labor and women's movement. It was also important because of her connections with the Americans. And it was an important shift in my own understanding, because she helped me see how the debate in 1919 was not just about East and West. even though that was certainly there. It was also about divisions within Asian countries. Japan claimed to be the leader of Asian countries, but it was also an imperial power. Her story really illuminated the intense class and gender divisions within Japan as well. And so that helped me, I guess, hold on to that theme as one that runs through the book, that this is about a story of many, many dimensions of power, multi-layers, imperial power, but cross-hatched by other hierarchies. There's inequality, certainly among nations, but also within. And I think that's part of the reason why the full rights feminists push for transforming the state and social democracy, along with thinking about, as Adam Getachew talks about, non-dominating world making, is very appealing one for the present day.
Thank you. Sonia, I believe you had a question. Do you want to jump in here if you unmute?
Sure. I'm sorry. I do want to let the audience in at some point, but I actually have two questions, and they're kind of related. And Leon Fink had a question in the Q&A about the limitations of this tradition that you're talking about, Dorothy. My first question is, I was surprised, and it won't surprise you to hear this question coming from me. There's no mention of childcare. There's no mention of any of your folks being concerned with childcare. There was one mention of somebody being familiar with a day nursery, I think in Chicago, maybe it was at Hull House, I'm not sure. And certainly they knew about the Lanham Act nurseries during World War II. And to me, childcare is very much part of the social democratic tradition. So I just wonder, did they ever think about it? I don't see it in the index. I couldn't find it anywhere. Did they ever think about childcare? And if not, why not? I mean, what do you think it says about the scope of their vision that they didn't think about childcare? And the second question picks up a little bit on Catherine's last comment, and that is a relation to the present day. One of the things that strikes me as so interesting and unique about Biden and Harris's policy towards Central America is it's really a beginning. I mean, it calls for considerable intervention into Central America as a way of halting or dealing with the causes of emigration. And I wonder, and it's a sort of almost a beginning of redistribution, of calling for radical redistribution to address the inequality among countries that leads to so much immigration. And I wonder if any of your folks ever thought about that, or would that have been a bridge too far? Would that have been stepping from social democracy into communism, do you think, if they had talked about really trying to address the international inequalities among countries?
Thank you for that. Let me just talk for a minute about their vision of paid and unpaid care and family work. You know, I think of the pre-New Deal and perhaps even up to World War II, the primary emphasis being on enabling women to both have the right to work, but also the right not to work. That the women that I write about talked about it as the double day, that many working class women and poor women wanted the right to care for their own family and the right to leisure time. And they saw things like limits on hours as a way of making that possible. I don't talk a lot about the push for childcare in the book, even though it does come up in some places. Mary Norton, who was one of the first congresswomen and from New Jersey, so I looked at her papers at Rutgers, and she was a very strong advocate of day nurseries for poor women. She also was primarily one of the main voices for the passage of the Lanham Act. And then also she and many trade union women lobbied to maintain those funds at the state level. I really talk more about that in the other women's movement, where women like Tilly Olson, for example, the working class writer, but she was also head of the CIO Women's Auxiliary in California. She and the waitress unions and other groups pushed very hard for the Lanham Act funds to be extended. Where childcare comes forward more so the story is with the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. And that is, those recommendations were very far-seeing and included publicly funded, available childcare. They were very clear that they wanted paid maternity leave, but also that paid and unpaid work were connected, that you could never value or raise the pay of care work in the labor market unless you valued housework and the work of families, and unless you made it possible for that work to be supported. They at times, and I tell this story in the book, they differed from the ideas of my own generation. They didn't always think that men would make the best caregivers, or that maybe they would, but they wouldn't necessarily take on those roles. But Esther Peterson talks about how she changed her mind about that, in part with her friendships with Sigrid Ekendahl in Sweden. She learned an enormous amount about all of these issues when she lived there for about 7 years. And she brought back to the President's Commission on the Status of Women proposals to professionalize household and care labor, to raise the standards, to unionize, and also to address issues of what Sigrid Ekendahl called family discrimination against all people who did caregiving, men and women. And I think that's a challenge that we still have, because even if you have gender neutral policies, it doesn't mean that that addresses fully the disadvantages that women face. So I would argue that we have to reimagine and restructure jobs so that time away from work is not demeaned. And of course, that we provide women access to childcare so they can choose where they want to spend their time, where they want to work, in the labor market or in the home. I don't know if that helps address some of your concerns, Sonia. And remind me of your last question.
I just wonder if given it seems like what they got from their international connections was networking and ideas and so forth. But I wonder if they ever thought about really restructuring the international system economically so that there would be more equality, economic equality between poor and rich countries. Did they
Yes.
extend that far?
Two things in response to that. I do think that the ILO was an arena they were attracted to because they thought that, in fact, it was a way of bringing up standards and making standard, or basically their phrase was raising the standard of life for all. So they thought of this as a norm that was global, and they were trying to design policies with that in mind. So that is one of the things that we're very concerned about. Just to use Esther Peterson again as an example, she was quite involved in the ILO in 1961 and 1962 when she was the US Assistant Secretary of Labor Standards. And she got herself put on a committee that was developing policies of developing economies. And this committee actually had, I think, a majority of people from the global South, a number of people from Chile, Venezuela, Mexico. She backed that support. She gave a rousing speech at the ILO about how we needed land reform, how we needed a tax on the wealthy nations, that we would never really solve these problems until we respected other nations' sovereignty. So she was aware of these issues. You know, again, it's not easy to think about how to solve them or how we can begin. But they were very much aware of the inequities among nations, as well as within.
Thank you. Sonia mentioned a comment, or a question rather, by Leon Fink, who comes from our larger universe of labor historians. And he asks in the Q&A, you offer a fulsome account of the strengths of international social democratic feminism, but what of its weaknesses? Where do you see its biggest lacunae and/or strategic failures?
That's a great question. I think it varies over the course of the 20th century. So there were different failures at different moments. Obviously, the Cold War period is distressing, even though in my chapter on the Cold War, I tried to make it very clear that I'm thinking about the superpowers both as empires and both as modernizers. And that I think of women on both sides of the Iron Curtain who were in the superpower nations as caught up in many of the blindnesses about the other and unable to think across those divides. At the same time, the Cold War did help advance some of their agenda. It's not unlike the old Mary Dudzik argument about civil rights, that in the ILO and the ICFTU, they made some changes because they felt that if they didn't, their rival would best them. So that, I think, was a real failing. And it's at that moment, in that chapter, I talk about the three worlds, the first, the second, and the third world. And many of the advances by the late 50s and into the 60s are coming from the third world or the global South, in part because they're thinking beyond that Cold War framework and not hampered by it.
Thank you. Let me get a last question from Susan Tellengater. And she touches upon something that Catherine spoke of in her comment. And she asks, how does your full rights feminism framework intersect with the typical framing of feminist waves? And why did you reject this typical framing? What did you learn by bypassing the wave approach? And would you argue for not including that framing in our approach and understanding of feminism from a US perspective?
I thought Catherine was very eloquent about this. A lot of people have written about it. I know we don't have much time. I would say begin with Nancy Hewitt's book, No Permanent Waves. What I was disturbed by in writing this book is how this US model sometimes now has gone global. So you see some of that same limiting periodization based on the activism of elite white women. And I think that's a problem. It's a problem in terms of temporal stories. I think we're better to nestle the story of US women's politics in the larger context of political events. So the progressive era, the New Deal, and to think about feminism as continuous. That's part of the problem with the wave, is that you have these moments where, 50 years where there are no feminists. I think we need to learn from every generation and to think about the movement as ongoing and continuous.
Thank you. I will just say that in my lectures on contemporary America, your middle book, The Other Women's Movement, essentially helps to structure the entire discussion. And I think what you do here in this book is to kind of further that argument and that framework, and that we would all benefit, I think, a good deal from reading it and engaging with it. We have only been able to scratch the surface of the many subjects that are raised in this book, but I'm afraid our time is about up, and I have the unfortunate task of drawing this to a close. So I want to express my thanks to Dorothy Sue, to Catherine, Yvette, and Sonia, as well as to those of you in the audience, and apologies to those whose questions we could not get to. I would invite you to join us next week on Monday, June 21st at 4 p.m. when we return to discuss Teasel Muir-Harmony's recent book, Operation Moonglow, A Political History of Project Apollo. We invite you to join us for that session. And with that, good night, thank you, and take care, everyone.